So, good evening. First, an apology. I don't speak German, not a word. I read that article recently of this guy who lived 20 years in Germany and was advocating for not learning German, which I tend to agree. It's so difficult. I don't know how you did it. It's going to be in English. I apologize. I hope you won't be shy with your questions. I'm French, so I make a lot of English mistakes too. Feel free to make some. So I understand that you have a blend of background. I'd like to understand a little bit better who you are so I can tailor the talk a little bit. My background is mostly technical, or if I do have an artistic background, it is in the technicalities of sound, not in the artistic music creation. So among all of you, who's playing music? Pretty much everyone. And who's recording music? Good half. And who's listening to a lot of music? All right, so we should be good. So music started really as a live element. People were singing, people were dancing, it was entertainment. It changed recently, it changed in the last 200 years. Prior to that, you had to be a king to listen to some music most of the time. You just didn't have access to it. How did it change? Well, it changed with advances in physics and associated mathematics. So of all of you, who has done some theory of the signal and mathematics associated with the signal, whether it's analog or digital? A little bit? Okay, so the topic today should hit home. So sound and its relationship to a signal, and the advantage of being able to say sound is a signal is that we can do math on it. Without this, mathematics are impossible. So can you highlight or can you give me definitions for a signal? Anyone? Yep.
Transportation of information.
Okay.
And by the way, is it possible to turn up the volume a little?
There's keine, wir können die Tür zumachen, keine Verstärkung, keine Beschallung.
Okay. It's fine, I just don't know where the output is. Alright, I'm going to try to talk fast, to talk louder then. So, a transport of information, that's one. Can you give me a more generic? Yep.
Amplitude on discrete time axis?
Not yet, but soon. Signal comes from, well, first it's a noun. It's pronounced signal. It's anything agreed upon or understood as the occasion for concerted action. And it's anything that serves to indicate one direct command or the like. Those are definitions from the literature. But now it's true that we're a bit more technically oriented. So I found several definitions. One for electronics, it's an electrical quantity or effect that can be varied in such a way as to convey information, which I think covered what you both said. In signal processing, it's an analog or digital representation of an analog physical quantity. And in information theory, it's a sequence of states in a communication channel that encodes a message. That would be the most generic definition for us. So, a signal, at least we're only going to consider signals that are real today. There are signals that are not real. We use them in electricity to resolve equations. For example, I is the square root of -1. It effectively is an imaginary number. It doesn't exist. So we're not going to touch on this today because we found ways to never have to touch it anymore, which is good because that was a bit painful. So those are generic and technical definitions for a signal. Now, what's music? What's music? You can be pretty broad. That was pretty broad. So, what's music? Okay.
Everything that's sounding.
Okay. Yep.
It's a sound that has some meaning.
It's a sound that has some meaning. It's anything that sounds.
maybe the communication of culture through sound.
They're all true. Yep.
It's an art of creating time.
Okay. Yes? With a red shirt, you had your hand up.
Yes, I also would say it's an art, but I think it's the art of expressing feelings or feeling emotions.
Okay. So I have one for you. I think they're all true. It was hard to find. Well, it's a noun. It's pronounced music. It's an art form whose medium is sound and silence. So without silence, no rhythm. So silence is an important part of music, not only the sound, but the lag thereof. So a sound, what is it in the physical form? It's an oscillation of pressure. It's transmitted through solid, liquid, or gas. And it's composed of selected frequency at sufficient level to be heard. That's one additional component to sound, is that you can hear it. All those definitions could be true, but if you don't hear it, then it's not a sound. So it also relates to our perception. And then silence. Silence is the lack of perceivable sound. It doesn't mean that the sounds don't exist, it just means that you can't hear them. So music is really our signal. And that signal is composed of sound and silence. Okay, that's a start. So, one more. What's noise? Oh, music, sounds. What's noise? Yep.
Probably anything you can hear.
Okay. I think that kind of covers it. So it's a noun, it's pronounced noise. Yep, you had your hand up.
I'd say it's a non-periodic sound.
A non...
Periodic. It's not like a tone.
do you think sounds or even music has to be periodic?
Well, at least a tone has to.
That's a tone.
Yeah. But a noise is as far as I'm concerned, not a tone, but just non-periodic sound.
So you would oppose noise and music. You would oppose, what I'm hearing is that you're opposing noise and music. So there's noise, and then there's music, and what's music is not noise.
No, that's not what I meant.
Okay.
You could also use noise in music. For example, the snare drum consists mostly of noise, and just a very little tone is in that specific sound.
Okay.
But, well, maybe, I don't know.
So noise is music.
Huh?
So noise is music, somewhat.
It's part of music.
Yep.
Yeah.
For example, an air hammer or something like that has even a periodic sound, and when you say it's a noise because it is annoying us.
So there's a sense of annoyance when we say noise, right? It kind of has a negative connotation. What's that noise? Your parents called you music noise, and they were not very pleased. Yes.
Annoying in German, I think we have different words, which are both translated with noise.
Oh, so there's...
So the one is the annoying one that we don't want to have in our recordings, for example, and the other one is just Geräusch.
Technical term.
Yeah, noise, for example, a waterfall creates a noise.
We'll get to that. So, it's a sound, or a sound of any kind. That's a noise. That's the first definition. A sound that is loud, unpleasant, unexpected, or undesired, and that would be the technical side of it. That's what you don't want in your recordings. So there's a notion of wanted versus unwanted, but music is noise. In electronic, and that relates to the noise floor or the unwanted effect, it's a random fluctuation of an electronic signal or electrical signal. In computer science, it's meaningless data we call noise when the data has no relevance compared to what we're trying to sort or process. And in physics, it's a disturbance that obscures or reduces the clarity of a signal. Same approach as noise floor. It's not something we really want. So, okay, we talk about sounds and noises, measuring the disturbance. So we hear surprisingly well. We hear from 20 micropascals of pressure up to 100 Pascal. That's a scale of 6 million between the smallest and the loudest disturbance. What are the limits? Well, the upper limit is pain, so I don't recommend you go there too often. We can talk about hearing loss later, but it's not that interesting. And the threshold of hearing is determined by your acuity. And your acuity, of course, will change over time and will also change over the course of a day. You notice that when you wake up in the morning, you hear better than when you go to bed at night. It's normal. It has to do with muscle relaxation. So to be able to describe that huge scale of 6 million, we use logarithmic scales. They're easier for us to handle, but also they relate to us. For you, a sound that is 100 micropascals and a sound that is 200 micropascal is not twice as loud. It's just a bit louder. So effectively, by using a log scale, and we use that for all the volume controls in audio, you feel that it's a natural progression of loudness, what in fact it isn't. It is a logarithmic progression of loudness. So what it means is that just when you're at the end of your volume control, you just have 6 dB left. You in fact have twice the amplitude left. So you effectively have a range of 2x. That's going to be important later. But for now, it's just how the disturbance is measured. Can someone tell me or highlight some other log scale that we use for measuring things? Yep. pH is a log scale. Yep.
In music, octaves.
So the frequency bands. So frequency bands, we usually put in octave. Anything else? Concentration. Viral blood concentration are expressed also in log scales. Same thing. So it's a pretty broad. There's a pretty broad usage of log scales to describe the human condition in general, whether it is to describe loudness or to describe concentrations. It's pretty much the most common scale that we use. So there's plenty of advantages using it. First one is it turns multiplications into additions. That's sweet. It's a lot easier to do. The other one is there's a few ones you can learn, and once you know them, they stay with you forever. You know that 0 dB means unity. You know that 6 dB means double. You know that 20 dB means 10 times. You know that 40 dB means 100 times, 60 dB 1,000 times. So there's a very easy relation between the scale and the signal that it describes. Even if you never use the equation that gives you one towards the other, just having an idea of how the scale scales gives you a hand when it's time to make a recording, mix a recording, or produce a recording. Questions about the log scale? You've all used it. Whether you use it consciously or you don't, dB indicators are everywhere. The view meters are in dB usually. So that's the log scale. Hearing, so we said that sound was noises we can hear. So if we look at the ear sensitivity, it is not at all like you read in the book that you hear from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. Yes, you do, if you're young and you didn't listen to Walkmans all your life. As you're getting older, that will change. But also, as the average pressure level changes, the linearity of the ear changes. So it was initially, the first graphs that you can see on the right was made by Fletcher and Manson. And they're called equiloudness profiles. And it says that if sounds have that shape at that level, you will perceive them as equally loud. So what you notice is that to get equally loud low frequency and mid-range frequency, you need to have a lot more low frequency than mid frequencies. So overall, we hear like a bell shape. We hear really well between 1 and 3 kilohertz. And then at both extremes, we don't hear so well. We hear better when it's louder. So the louder it is, the more linear your ear becomes. which explains why perception of bass in a nightclub is usually higher than it will be at lower level. So a little example on this. Manufacturers of hi-fi equipment realized this. So what they did is the loudness control. So now the loudness control is a button, but it wasn't like that before. You would set your volume control to the maximum you would ever listen. And then the loudness was actually a knob that you would turn that would drop the music loudness, but it would drop it with that kind of shape. You still can find it on some equipment. Yamaha still sometimes have on their high-end receiver really a loudness knob. And the goal here was for you to be able to perceive bass and high frequency even at low level. So that was the first practical application of the Fletcher and Manson curves, was really to create loudness controls. So you didn't have the feeling that all of a sudden there was no bass and everything was very muffled. It would ease audition at low level. So other little weirdness. You don't hear the same way with your left and right ear. They don't get damaged the same way. They were even not made the same way. So effectively, your left and your right hearing is different. Your brain compensates for that. The brain compensation is something amusing. I don't know who had long hair in their life and then they trimmed them and had short hair. Wow, that's a good number. Did you notice something for the first 2 hours? You hear really well on the back. It's weird. And then after that it goes, because your brain adapts and then you don't notice anymore. But yeah, for like about 2 hours, you notice like side and back perception, high frequency. That's very stunning. It goes, but it's funny. You should try, get your hair long and then trim them again. And also it's subject to masking. So masking is more, and I'm not going to go into too much detail in the way the ear is made, but it's basically a tube that looks like an hair. Liquid, la la la. So when you have a very loud frequency, it has a tendency to create a mask around it. A mask where other frequencies, if they're below that mask, you're not really going to hear them. That's a masking theory. So on the bottom diagram, you can see that there's a loud tone, the white tone, and it creates the mask around it. And so the lower tones are masked, and you're not supposed to hear them. That's how all the compressors like MP3 and AAC are working to reduce the amount of information, is that they decide with masking processes that you're not going to hear those frequencies, and it just removes them. So the more you compress, the more aggressive the masking happens, and the more you may hear it. Why low bitrate audio sounds not so nice is all of a sudden, all that removing bands, you start to notice it. The lie is not working anymore. And there's another aspect of our audition is the binaural sound capture. We have 2 ears. And it's not so we have one extra one in case we lose it. It actually allows to perceive direction. So how does it work? Well, the first thing is phase. So one signal will hit one ear before the other. So we can figure out the direction, but only 180 degrees, right? Because whether the sound is in front or on the back of you, the direction would be the same. So you only have 180 degrees. Now there's the shape around that ear here. So what that does is it's going to shape the frequency response depending on if the sound comes from the front or the back. And that allows you to figure out where they come from. So there's really 2 combined effects here. There's the delay, and that gives you 180 degrees direction. And then there's a frequency shaping, and that gives you the front to back. It works supremely well. The resolution for front direction is about 2 degrees. On the back of your head is around 3 degrees. So it's extremely tuned. It actually exceeds our theoretical frequency response. Means the delay is actually thinner in time than the maximum frequency we can hear, surprisingly. So why was that design? If we believe in design or whatever, how did that happen? It was probably an alarm system. It would warn animals of where the predators come from. And that's why the precision is so good. But that's also why it's instantaneous. You don't have to think about it. It's like if we were talking about a computer, it's a hardware module. Immediately, your head turns toward the noise without thinking. So that's how we hear, or at least that's a brief overview of what and how we hear, and that is going to be helpful later. So the sound of music. We talked about signal, we talked about music, and we talked about sound and noise. So really, what's music? We know music is our signal, but we still haven't really defined it. So in music composition, several times in history people said that everything had been invented and it was only like redoing the same thing. Well, actually, I don't think so. Between new technologies and new talents, I hope there's many among you, we should be able to keep on making new things. And so far in the last 40, 50,000 years, it's been going on. So hopefully it's going to keep on going, but also because of technology, it's going to accelerate. So we're up to be surprised. So, all right, we can create an endless, literally endless amount of music, but let's look at it with the tools we have. We said it was a signal, so we should be able to look at it with the tools we have. Two tools we have. We can look at it in the frequency domain or in the time domain. It appears that we're here in the frequency domain, right? So actually it appears that we're here in both domains. We can recognize a tone, and we can recognize direction. So we have two modes of hearing. One of them is temporal, the other one is frequency-based. So if we look at the frequency one, I plotted the power spectral density, so the same thing as the curve you saw before about the ear response. I plotted that for a bunch of music, from classical to country music, with a little detour by rap, punk, and techno. And it turns out that if we look at power spectral density, they all look the same. Pretty much, or so similar. Who would know that classical music was exactly like hip-hop? So what's the stimulus behind sound? It's creation. It's not a stimulus we can really quantize or we can really measure. It's whatever goes through your head. We talked about using noise to make music. We talked about music being noise. So apparently there's an endless amount of possibilities. It's all based on the creative impulses. That hopefully will never be quantified. And it's what we're trying to do. We're trying to do art. We're trying to express our emotions. I think it was raised earlier today. So effectively, those two quantities are not to be measured or modelized. They just happen. They're ours. And maybe we'll keep them away from technology forever. So what it means is that there's no mathematical model for it. There's no autocorrelation. Means the music you made a second ago will be different than the music you make a second later. They're not necessarily related. They can be. Minimalist track will have exactly the same thing repeated 1,000 times, but it's not a necessity. So overall, it's not autocorrelated. Even if you know an infinite number of previous samples, you cannot predict the next sample. That's the definition of non-correlated or non-autocorrelated, which means that it's effectively completely random. And that defines sound as a completely random signal that cannot be modelized by mathematics, which is noise. So music is noise. Your parents were right. So the color of noise. I'm sure you all heard white noise, pink noise, brown noise, gray noise. Do you have any relationship to noise? Do you know which one is louder? Do you know what sounds like which? No? What's the worst noise?
It's the white noise.
True. So it's called white because, and there's a little graph, so it's pretty easy. It has a flat power spectral density. That makes it particularly annoying because it's very hissy. So I hope we're on. Yeah, we're on. So that would be white noise. And I don't know if you noticed, but it's a strange masking effect. It really covers everything. It's very difficult to hear me now. It's easier now. Then the second noise that was discovered or presented was actually not pink noise. It was brown noise. And brown noise is describing a Brownian motion. What's a Brownian motion is the noise made by particles in a viscous liquid. So if you drop a few particles in a liquid, the way they're going to move in the liquid, that's the Brownian noise. And the Brownian noise, it's called brown, not because of the color, but because of the discover. And that's a very muted sound. All the noise here have been loudness matched. So in terms of their measured level, they're all the same. but we don't perceive them at all the same way. So that's all well and nice, but it doesn't look like music. Music is not a 1 over f squared, which is a second order filter. Music is more like 1 over f. So in fact, if we look at all the music and we integrate all this into a bag, we end up with pink noise. And so essentially, music is pink noise. A lot more, but we can reduce it to its simplest components and it becomes pink noise. So the thing we haven't talked about here at all is silence. We're only talking about the noise. Right? So gray noise, well, in the previous slide, we talked about our perception of frequencies that isn't flat, right? So it is shaped where we hear better in the mid-range, not so much at low and high frequency. So there's a bunch of gray noise that can be created, which are supposed to be perceptually flat, which means you're going to perceive all the frequencies to be at the same level. As we've seen, that depends on loudness, so there's not a gray filter. There's a series of gray filters. They can be more or less complicated. The most common is the A weighting filter, and you see it if you look at DJ equipment or audio equipment in general. They give you like a signal to noise ratio, and then there's an A between parentheses. That's because they've applied that type of filter to measure the noise, assuming that anyway, you don't hear noise really well at low and high frequency, so it makes sense to indicate the noise floor that has been pre-filtered for your hearing. So that's the A weighting. So usually, and the reason why it's always used is because it gives slightly better numbers. So if we try gray noise here, that's what it sounds like. So there's not a lot of low frequency out of this, but effectively that would be a noise that is relatively flat over frequency. So in terms, the noise here are ranked for their loudness. So white is the worst, 2 is the pink, then Brownian, then gray noise. So that relates to the power spectral density of music. It doesn't at all covers rhythm or silence, right? It's just a very long-term approximation of what music is. Question on the noise? They're pretty easy. No. So what's our signal? So, okay, we start to see what a noise is. We said music was our signal. So what's that signal in the noise? So it's a physical quality. It's a time variant pressure wave. From the diagrams earlier, we know that we hear about 120 dBs of dynamic range. Between the smallest sound and the biggest sound, there's around 120 dB range. We know its mathematical representation. It's a time domain function, right? It's pressure over time. So it's a two-dimensional function. And we know that it's completely random over time. There's no prediction model that works. That's music. So we can define the transport medium, and I think someone mentioned that with the first question. The transport medium will always be defined by its dynamic range, which means its noise floor on one side, and the maximum signal it can take or produce on the other. That's the dynamic range. The frequency bandwidth, all real elements are low-pass filters. Bandwidth is never infinite. Bandwidth is only infinite in mathematics. So whatever you take as musical instrument, whatever you take as electronic instrument, it is a low-pass filter. At some point, it will attenuate over frequency. Everything is, if they're real. If they're not real, then it's different. And the transport medium will also be defined by its nonlinearity. Nonlinearities are distortions of any kind. Usually, electronic manufacturers talk about total harmonic distortion, although that measurement is quite meaningless. But there's a lot of mechanisms behind distortion. Some of them we hear really well. One example is heavy clipping. Heavy clipping, we will see that later. Heavy clipping introduced both harmonic and intermodulation distortion. The harmonic ones, you don't hear so well, but the intermodulation is very audible. So if we start to talk about distortions, we're going to have to talk about which ones and how they contribute to the sound. saying distortion, like if it was a ghost or a monster, doesn't help. It isn't. A common and famous example, turntables are a tremendous distortion generator. And if you look at the signal on the scope, it's horrid. It sounds fine. Tube amplifiers, especially single-ended triodes that audiophiles love, measure it, it's awful. It sounds fine. A $10 Class D amplifier from Japan that we use in cell phones measure amazingly well. It sounds horrible. So really, it's hard to point the finger here, but we'll try to go through the mechanisms and see how they impact the sound. So I don't know how much time I want to spend on this, but I wanted to go through the various mediums that we've used for sound recording and playback over time, and how it all started. So in fact, it all started at the same time. The radio, the physical mechanical recording, those things, it started like in 1870, roughly. So there was an attempt in 1856 by some dude I forgot the name of, but it was able to record and play back tones. It didn't have the resolution or the quality to be able to record or play back tones. So essentially, because tones are not enough, I just dropped it. The first one that actually managed to record something and play it back was Thomas Edison. And it was a cylinder covered with tin foil that would imprint markings on the tinfoil during recording and then attempt to play them back. The tinfoil was then replaced with wax. In both cases, it sounded pretty awful, and it lasted for about a minute. The replay was done completely mechanically. It was a little stylus attached to like a little membrane, which is mostly made of bakelite. It's just an old form of plastic, and then a cone in front of it. Of course, it was painful to listen to, but it was just a start. Then 25 years later, the gramophone, which is the same idea, but flat on a disc instead of a cylinder, with many advantages in terms of storage, but also in terms of protecting the medium and all that. So in fact, quickly the gramophone took over the cylinder just because it was more practical. Not so different than this is taking over because it's more practical as well. In 1948, Columbia released the long play. The long play was actually a new way to make the vinyl, where the groove was a lot smaller. So it's a micro groove versus a regular groove. They also would rotate not as fast. So all that, in fact, is possible because of new plastics. It has nothing to do. I mean, of course, there was advances in a lot of areas of electronic, but the main ingredient here was to be able to make plastics that were rigid as a micro element, but that were not brittle. So it didn't break that easily. So the big problem with all those formats were the limitations. The mechanical subsystem had limits. We couldn't push as hard as we want in terms of loudness. The noise floor was high between the friction and the particles. It was a nightmare. The frequency response was awful. I don't know if you've heard a gramophone recently, but it's not very flattering. And there was some wow and flutter. So because the rotation was not completely constant, but also because of the motion of the stylus created and nonlinearities were created just by itself. So that didn't work so well. It didn't work so well, but it was still dominating the home entertainment market until 1991. Until 1991, most of the consumption of music at home was made on vinyl. So for something that didn't work so well, 100+ years of lifespan it's a good deal. So still, quickly, electrical transcription happened, but it didn't happen to record music, in fact. It really happened to record your voice and to transmit it to some other place. It was a telephone, right? So the telephone was quite a feat, if we think about it. At the same time, they had to figure out how to record sound, how to play back sound, and how to transmit sound electrically. So to transmit sound electrically, we kind of have an idea. We had the telegraph for a while, right? So we knew we could transmit electrical impulses, but the telegraph, which is basically binary, noise or no noise, was inherently robust to noise, right? Because it was a very simple signal. The more complex the signal is, the more dynamic range it requires. So all that super high noise floor had to be controlled to be able to do that voice transmission. So what it does is it converts those pressure waves into electrical voltage instead of mechanical force onto a stylus. So it was not all made by Bell's laboratory. Mr. It's Bell. Mr. Bell in 1876 figured out how to make a loudspeaker, and Mr. Berliners in 1976 figured out how to make a microphone. And then that patent was bought by Bell Labs a year later, so he could incorporate this and make his telephone. So overall, it was more than one person's invention. But it was essentially an American invention at that time. The first evolvement towards music was by Magnavox in 1915. In fact, the guy behind Magnavox, designed his first loudspeaker in 1901. And it was very similar to the speakers you have at your house today. It was an electromechanical element with a coil and a magnet and a cone. So effectively, we've been following that technology for over 100 years. And the first iteration of really making a loudspeaker, electrical loudspeaker for music use, was in fact more for voice use, and it was to do a public address in the street. So the goal was to be able to alert citizens during wartime and things like that. And that's really how Magnavox started. So that's not too interesting, but that's the most interesting part. So the two previous, for the disc and the cylinder, it was really to record music or to try to find a way to record sounds in general. But broadcasting started really early on in 1870 with a théâtrophone. The théâtrophone was, instead of using the telephone to communicate with your neighbors across the globe, it was actually a link between the opera and some selected customer who were willing to pay so they could listen to the opera from their house. Or they could listen to the opera from not being in the opera house, but in a listening room. So it was a closed network, like closed CCTV, closed cameras today. And they started to distribute a newspaper, the telephone newspaper, which included news and entertainment programming to try to incite customers to try their system. So it's not so different than your cable television provider today. So that started a long time ago as well. In 1920, the first radio broadcasting started. It was based on amplitude modulation, or AM. AM was quite a feat at the time. It was a very broad diffusion. I'm talking about here about 500 kilometers, which would, if you're right in the center of Germany, would cover the entire country. But in fact, with certain weather condition, AM can be heard on the other side of Earth by reflecting on the clouds. So actually, AM is, even today with the short waves, is the longest range transmission we typically use with a single transmitter. So in terms of the idea of diffusion, one transmitter and many, many receiver, AM radio was actually the best diffusion system we've ever had. If we think about cell phones today, the range around a tower is usually less than a kilometer. So in here, we're talking about 20,000 kilometers, and it's just working fine. So it was unreliable, especially with weather conditions. It was noisy. It was sensitive to electromagnetic interactions, in particular lightning storm. So yes, the range sometimes was impacted by natural phenomena, but it was still impressive. So in the 30s, they wanted to address those issues with the AM and provide customers with a better quality. They started FM. So FM is more local, usually diffusion is around 50 kilometers, but it has a lot more bandwidth overall. The bandwidth of AM is limited to 10 kilohertz. That means each station is spaced by 10 kilohertz. If you exceed 10 kilohertz, you're in your neighbor's house. With FM, they decided to leave a lot more room because the FM band was a lot wider. Designed to address the limitations of AM radio, it was a lot quieter, so much quieter and such an anticipation that it was actually the best sounding sound media until 1980. It was better than vinyl, and it was better than tape. It had more bandwidth and more dynamic. So in fact, today we think FM is crap. Well, it kind of is, but that's what we made of it. FM is a good format. somehow it's been, because of commercial interest, it's changed into what we know today with, the loudness war, over-processing and all that. But when it comes to the native medium, it was dominating in terms of performance for almost 50 years, or over 50 years. Briefly, because I have to talk about it, in the 60s, really, the television took over. So the first TV programs were in the 20s. We started to see TV sets appearing in the 30s. They started to be popular, but very expensive in the 40s. But really, the 60s, 50s and 60s are the years of TV. It's a local diffusion like FM. It has a really high bandwidth for pictures, but it was really not focused on audio. For the longest time, television was mono and was basically sounding like an AM radio more than anything else. So really, the focus was elsewhere. So we know how to transmit that signal. We know how to transmit it to the other side of Earth. We know how to record it, but we don't know how to record it that well. We can do vinyls, but at the time, without electrical recording, vinyls were a nightmare to make. It was a direct transfer to disk, which means that the stylus would cut a master at the same time as the recording was operating. It was sensitive to vibration. It was really not practical. So our scientists devised ways to record sound onto a magnetic tape. So magnetic tape, we all know what it is. It's a piece of plastic with a magnetic element on it that can be orientated by a magnetic field. Once it's orientated, it settles unless another magnetic field reorients it differently. So once you've imprinted your magnetism on the tape, it will keep it for a certain amount of time, and you will be able to play it back. So it started to try to record the telephone by the police in the 20s already. So it was actually a police advance, or at the request of the police. In the 40s, it was developed a lot in Germany by AEG and BASF. BASF was taking care of the tape, AEG was taking care of the machine, and they came up with a magnetophone. That was actually very interesting for the Americans, and in 1945, they pretty much swooped everything they could about the magnetophone and started to use it for broadcast. Broadcast because, and it was mostly pushed by Bing Crosby's, who hated to be in broadcast studio. It was loud, it was chaotic because it was live all the time. He really couldn't stand it. So he really pushed very hard to be able to pre-record his broadcast. The first pre-recorded broadcast was 1947, and it was Bing Crosby. So same as vinyl, there's format limitations, and same as vinyl, there's a maximum modulation index. You can only put so much magnetism on that tape. It all depends on how much magnetic material there is. So we had different type of tapes, right? We had ferroxide, then we had metal tapes. So all those tapes, the goal was to be able to imprint more and more magnetism on it, to be able to load more and more, to store more and more magnetism. But there was still a limitation. There were time domain variations, same as the vinyl was not able to rotate completely steadily. Same problem with the tape, it was not completely stable. So it had some wow and flutter as well. There was a very annoying persistent white noise that we didn't really know how to deal with, and there was no random access. When you try to go from track 1 to track 2, you have to wait a little while. And although it had all those limitations, it had the best studio performance until the mid-90s. So here there's actually a famous tape recorder and player from Studer. It's called the C37. And the C37 would dominate studio recording until 1985. Yep?
Could you please explain what exactly wow and flutter is?
What?
Exactly wow and flutter is.
Okay, so if your time domain is not constant and changes over time, there's going to be some modulation. Whoa, that's a wow. And the flutter will be, instead of those long variations that you can hear, they're going to be very short duration variations. And what they're going to do is, it's essentially the same mechanism. It's just because it's at a different frequency range, we consider it differently. But essentially, it's a non-linearity in the time domain. Right? So the time for us is a continuous element, but for those machines, it's somehow kind of not continuous.
Is 20 hertz and 20 kilohertz?
It is as well, yeah.
It is.
Yeah. So the way to fix this was to use heavy counterweight. Remember, so like turntables have that giant platter. Those tape recorders, or even the tiny ones you're carrying around, the Walkman had actually a weighted counterweight with a capstan. And the goal here was to try to minimize the variation of timing, right? But they all had it. And they all had it to a significant amount. I mean, you know, up to the 50s or 60s, we're talking several percent. We started to see 0.1, 0.2, 0.5% in the 70s. So that was a recurrent problem. Less of a problem at the studio because you could spend, you know, whatever amount of euros onto your equipment, and as you can see, it's sized like a washing machine. But when you try to have this at home or in your pocket, the problem was a bit more difficult to address. So that particular C37, Prince bought one in 1992. He bought it for $1.5 million. And he used it to remaster his music. So it was all recorded in digital, mixed in digital, and then it was run through an analog tape player to try to get the sound out. And then after that, so it was basically part of the mastering process. So funny anecdotes, if you go to the tape project, I think it's www.tapeproject.org, they are renovating older tape decks like this one, and they're also selling mastered tapes. So you can buy 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch master tapes. And there are, like pretty much every hi-fi show has the tape project in demo there, and it's true that it sounds stunning. And it's surprising that it basically revolves technologies we have today. It doesn't have the flexibility. You still have to cut your tapes with a knife. But it certainly had the goodies when it comes to recording and playback. To give you an example, they have around 110 dB dynamic range. The CD has 96. So in fact, the CD was a reduction of dynamic range, not an increase. So of course, compared to the music cassette, the small tapes we had at home, that was crap, guaranteed. But those ones actually worked really well, and they sounded pretty good. They sounded so good that they're still in use today. So although finding parts for them now is really difficult, they can still be restored, and they sell for millions. So it's a bit of a surprise. So film and sound, I just wanted to touch on this. That's a slice of a pretty recent movie. I'm not going to tell you which one, because it doesn't matter. But we can see there's a bunch of stuff. So the movie would be at the bottom. The movie would be there. But we see several stuff. We see like little holes at the outer edge, and those are external device sync. So how it all started is you would have a gramophone playing music with the movie, and they were trying to synchronize the two. So at first it was done mechanically, then it was done optically. So that's for external device sync. And all those little holes would give the tempo for the music to play at the right rate. Then there were analog on film. So analog on film would be 1 or 2 tracks. There are 2 tracks alongside the film. And they're basically amplitude encoded. So it's like AM radio, sort of. And they would be read optically by a little light and a photodetector, so photodiode or phototransistor. Then they started to go all digital on us, but they would keep the analog track because some theaters wouldn't have it. So they would keep the analog tracks, and then Dolby started to insert the Dolby Digital in between the perforations. That proved to be a problem because the perforation would get damaged over time, and then you would start to lose track on Dolby. That's why, although the Dolby Digital is digital, you still have sometimes some weird crackling noises. That would be more a remnant of analog than digital. And then Sony added their SDDS, Sony Digital Dynamic, whatever sound, at the outer edge, at the inner edge, in between the perforations and the movie. Same thing, they had a little bit of wear and tear for the SDDS tracks. So when the wear and tear on the digital tracks was going too badly, they would revert to the analog tracks. That's why they were never gone. So that's what you can see on a traditional film theater, Although more and more theaters right now have switched to digital projection, those are still in use today. Distortion, we talked about it, so now we're in it. So aside from the loss of sound, which is a distortion of sorts, we can break down distortions into 3 types. The first one is harmonic distortion. So I'm gonna have to go on the other end. Harmonic distortion, what it does, well, if you have a signal on 1 and you start to have harmonic distortion, you're gonna start to find remnants of the signal at integer multipliers of the signal. So let's say you have a 1 kilohertz signal and you start to have distortion on it, you're gonna start to find energy at 2 kilohertz, 3 kilohertz, 5 kilohertz, 7 kilohertz, 9 kilohertz. So we usually separate even and odd distortion. Odd distortion sounds like loudness. Why? Because if you hear something that's too loud, your ear naturally will stop the excursion because it's a mechanical system and it has limits. And when it starts to stop that excursion, it creates harmonics. And the harmonics are primarily odd. So in fact, a lot of odd distortion just by itself will just tell you it's loud. It won't tell you much. We did a bunch of tests. My first job was to work for a company that made devices for radio. So of course, with radio and competitive loudness, we're trying to have the fattest bass of the industry. But how do you do that knowing that it's FM? You can't crank the loudness as much as you want because there's legal limits. And if you exceed those legal limits, you bleed on your neighboring station, and then you get shut down by the FCC and fined. So it's not like we can crank the bass, we had to find other ways. So we made all those studies, and we invited a bunch of people, and we had like super fancy subwoofer, and then distortion generators. When there's no distortion, because you don't hear bass, so there's not a lot of bass. If you start to add distortion, little by little, people think there's a lot more bass. In fact, there's not more bass, it's all in the mid-range. So the tricky part about bass is that we don't hear it well. And if the bass is really clean, you won't notice it's there because you don't hear it well. We can even say that we perceive it better with our body than with our ears sometimes. Everybody went to a nightclub with a lot of bass, you know what I'm talking about. But essentially, the perception of bass will be heavily depending on its distortion, not the fundamental. So overall, distortion is not overly audible. Just harmonic distortion by itself is not even very annoying. Another example would be tube amplifiers that have very high harmonic distortion, and they sound fine. People love them. So overall, harmonic distortion just by itself, it's not really a problem, or it doesn't seem to really affect us so much. Now, there's other types of distortion, which is intermodulation. So intermodulation is what happens when, for example, you have clipping. So you have low frequency and high frequency together, and at some point you're reaching the limit of your system. Well, what happens here is you generate the harmonic distortion of the low frequency only, not the high frequency, and the high frequency disappears by segment. That's intermodulation, and that we hear supremely well. So intermodulation, how it presents itself in the spectra is if we had the frequency F1 and F2, so low frequency high, high frequency low, then we start to have products. F2 minus 2F1, F2 minus F1, F1 plus F2 plus F1, and F2 plus 2F1. Those, somehow, we hear really well. So if you had to trade, it would be better to have a high harmonic distortion content than a high intermodulation content. The thing, and that's why in most electronic equipment, they only talk about harmonic distortion. Because more often than not, their intermodulation distortion performance would not be that pretty. So the last one, and that's one that we don't even know how to measure properly, is TIM. TIM is transient intermodulation. It's that, in fact, the signal itself will model both harmonic distortion and intermodulation distortion. So it means that here we're showing two static models of distortion, but in fact they change over time. And that's transient intermodulation. And this apparently would be a much better way to describe the distortion for a system, but there's no really common way to measure it. It's really not possible because it's time dependent. So here we're in between the rock and a hard place where we'd like to talk about quality. We can talk about harmonic distortion, but we don't hear it very well. Most of the time, harmonic distortion comes with intermodulation. Okay, so we know we hear intermodulation, but the fact that it changes over time, So in fact, what we measure today, and even with our $50,000 audio precision and all those measuring equipments we have, we're actually measuring things that don't really relate to what we hear. So that's why it's really funny to see like the number war between manufacturers with 0.00006% THD. Well, in fact, it doesn't tell you much, but it's a nice waste of time. Which means that you're still stuck with listening to your gear. We're sorry about that. There's no universal truth. So noise control. So we talked about distortion, that's one. We also said that pretty much every medium that we used, tape, vinyl, all those had noise. And that noise was predominantly white, which is annoying because it's really masking. So the way to address this is actually an old way. It's called pre-emphasis. Pre-emphasis would increase the level of high frequency versus low frequency, which would have two benefits. The first one is that it would linearize the audio signal. We saw that the audio signal was pink distributed, so it has a lot of low frequency, but not so much high frequency. By applying a pre-emphasis, we rebalance this. So what it means is that if you take the example of a turntable, for example, at low frequency, it would have to move that much. But at high frequency, it would have to move that much. So it would allow to equalize all this and have a more constant amplitude over frequency, which would make packing the record a lot better. Right? So that's when the micro groove really happened, is also when all the pre-emphasis would allow for it to happen by reducing the width of the groove, by rebalancing those signals. And then you would do the opposite filtering, so you would remove all that excess high frequency during playback to go back to the natural signal. But the advantage here is you're applying that filtering right before playback, which means that you're applying that filtering to all the noise from the medium too. And that noise was white, but now you low pass filter it, so it becomes pink or brown. So with the same process, you overcome the lack of frequency linearity of your signal, and you remove a lot of noise from your medium. That was pre-emphasis and de-emphasis. So have you ever heard about that stuff? Who has? Oh, there's a little bit. Okay. So where has it been used before? Do you know? Where has pre-emphasis and de-emphasis been used before? In what? What was it called? RIAA. That's one of them, actually. That's the most popular one. It's the Recording Industry of America, whatever. But there are actually a bunch of them also. There was one from a DEUTSCH gramophone as well. So that was just one of them. On really, really fancy phono preamps, sometimes you can select which pre-emphasis curve was used for the recording. Most of the common ones don't have that. Where else was it used?
Tape decks, like the Dolby.
No, Dolby is different.
Pardon?
Dolby is different.
Yeah.
Yep. What?
On CDs.
On CDs, pre-emphasis, yeah. It was not used for long, right? Okay. So, in fact, it was used on tape decks, but it wasn't Dolby. Dolby is an evolution of this. But it was used, the IR correction on vinyl, and many others. I just named the popular one. It was used in FM and AM. Both were pre-emphasized. FM in the United States was pre-emphasized with a 75 microsecond filter and 50 microsecond in Europe. But they were pre-emphasized as well. Tapes, same thing. And the pre-emphasis was different depending on the tape material. If it was chromium oxide, it had a different pre-emphasis of metal tapes. So if you would record a metal tape with a pre-emphasis of a chromium dioxide tape, it would sound very bright. So they added little holes on the back of the tape so the tape player could automatically detect which tape was in. But that really happened in the 80s. So really, it was used pretty much on everything we use. And yeah, including the CD. For a brief moment early on in the CD, they had a pre-emphasis as well, which was more actually historical because the CD didn't really need it. And it actually was detrimental to performance. We'll see why. The CD was not the right medium for that. but it was used basically on everything we used for sound recording and transfer. So it is if we want to talk about the loudness war, which we will, it really started with pre-emphasis. And pre-emphasis, it really started from a good idea, which is how can we make audio more white over frequency because our medium is more linear? And B, how can we get rid of that damn white noise from the recording and playback system? So that brings us to nonlinear dynamics processing. So that started with FM, or actually that started with AM, where some presenters had a very asymmetrical voice. So it's hard to fire someone because like his voice doesn't record well. So that was really a problem because we can find a up to 1-to-3 ratio between the bottom and the top. So we ended up with all those people with very asymmetrical noise on the radio. Then they would try to push that to the transmitter and they would blow up the transmitter on one of the peaks. So it's always a bit expensive. So there was a great desire to control the peak of the signal to protect the transmitter, right? Those things were expensive. Technology was early on. So the goal was to be able to essentially modify the signal's dynamic range and to be able to control it, and here for safety reasons. And what we realized is that if we modify the gain of a signal dynamically, we multiply two functions together. So that generates distortion. So it doesn't come for free, but it was a necessary evil. The first way they prevented blowing up their transmitters was by using a crude clipper. So basically, the values would be bonded, and if the signal would exceed the value, it would just stay at that value. So it was very crude, it was really harsh, and it was really a protection system. We were not talking about loudness yet. But you use it in the recording studio. You use it all the time, in fact. You use this to remove noise gate. So noise gate was initially developed for telephony. And the goal was to try to remove the annoying hissing between two people communicating. It's still used today. Sometimes when someone stops talking, all of a sudden you feel like you're alone. That's because the noise gate kicked in. I find it very oppressive sometimes when I'm on the phone. So you've all noticed it, that the line goes completely dead. That's because the other person stopped talking, and really there's a noise gate in the network that completely cuts the noise. So in cell phone, for example, we inject comfort noise, so you don't notice it. So instead of you hearing like all of a sudden the noise drop, we actually re-inject pink noise to give you some comfort, so you don't feel alone. We use it also to reduce dynamic range. Some people scream really loud even when they sing, and so that needs to be managed, people. So instead of telling that girl with that fantastic voice to just shut up, which is never nice, we started to apply dynamics processing here, and mostly limiting. So limiters exist for a long time. The first limiters were tube-based. And it became the first really voice-shaping element. A lot of people, you would hear them without a limiter, you would barely recognize their voice. The limiter is tuned. Some people are very picky. The singer from Eurythmics is an absolute nightmare because she's so picky about her limiter setting. There's also all those people who move the microphone all the time. So they're fighting between a natural limiting of just dispersion and then electrical limiting. So that can have some pretty surprising results sometimes. We also use them to increase dynamic range. So expanders, right? Expanders are used mostly to expand sound that would be very compressed or unpleasant. They're used a lot in commercials, for example. Personally, I find them to be less interesting. We can do a lot more with limiters than with expansion. Expansion is always delicate to use, but it's used for artistic effects sometimes. Do you ever use expanders? Do you have specific use for expanders when you record music? Yeah, usually they suck, don't they? I don't know, I'm not a fan of expanders, but they exist, right? You can actually stretch dynamic range instead of compressing it. Mostly, the only good expander use case is the noise gate, which is effectively an expander because you remove noise. So it's as if you had more dynamic range. But aside from noise gating, expanding in music recording and production is not such a common occurrence. And then we started to use it for media and broadcast. So like I said, peak control, right? We don't want to blow up our transmitter, and we don't want to get sued by the FCC because we exceeded our Carlson bandwidth. That's the name of the FN bandwidth you're allowed per channel. So peak control was a big one. Peak control would save you a lot of money, both in equipment and in fines. But then it started to turn into something else. It started to also be used for modeling. So radio stations wanted to have a constant sound signature. They wanted to, they sell you more than just, or they propose you more than just music and radio programs. They also propose you a sound. That would be very true in the 80s and 90s in New York City, where it was already competitive loudness war, and Z97 was the big hip-hop radio station, and they wanted to sound the loudest on the dial and spend a tremendous amount of money for this. So competitive loudness really came from FM broadcasting. But not only. But that was the beginning of the loudness war. So, what happened? So 30s and 40s radio broadcast, the noise floor of radio was high, maximum modulation was low, so dynamic range was not so good. So it was about 40 dB for AM and up to 76 dB for FM. Like I said, FM was, for the longest time, a pretty decent media. 50s and 60s, jukebox started to appear in bars and nightclubs. That was a way for patrons to be able to choose their music. And it got so popular that they started to receive music before it was available in stores. It was used as the first viral marketing tool. So you would have a lot of control over music if you had a radio station. You would have a lot of control over music if you also owned a bunch of jukebox and would fill them. So the Motown realized this, and in the 70s and 80s, they started to overprocess the vinyl so they would sound louder, because sounding louder on the jukebox would mean you would sell more albums somehow. So in jukebox, of course, the loudness was constant. Nobody was tweaking the volume control. It was just the way it was. So if you can get a little bit louder, you would punch through, people would hear you better, you had a better chance of being heard, you would sell more albums. So realizing this, it really started with the Motown, and it's true that if you get original recordings from the Motown, they're pretty loud compared to everything else. So they realized this early on. We all ended up in the 90s with the compressor years. All the media sounded so loud. All the remastered media sounded so loud that a lot of people started to complain about quality. So we start to see, I mean, you've all heard about the loudness war. I saw that there was another talk in 2012 with a record producer that will talk as well about the loudness war. I don't really want to talk about is it a good idea or not. All I'm going to tell you is that to be successful, you're going to have to sell shit. And if you want to sell shit, you're going to have to play by the rule. And if the rule is the loudness war, you'd better do it. So now let's see how we can do it right. Saying, oh, no, I'm too good for that, doesn't really carry. So the loudness war is here, and we have tools to make it happen. So what we don't really want to do, people call that a hard limiter. A hard limiter is a clipper, right? So it basically puts two boundaries around the signal, one positive and one negative. If you exceed those, you're clipped. There's no more signal. It's just saturated to a unique value. It's a tremendous tool to increase loudness, but it's also a tremendous tool to increase distortion. So although it can be used, it has to be used with a lot of moderation. Just increasing the volume, like I've seen on so many CDs, just is not the best idea. So now there's several types of limiters, which are not hard limiters. All of a sudden they're managed limiter, which means they effectively control the loudness. There's a feed-forward limiter. The feed-forward limiter is just a feed-forward process. It can provide medium to high loudness increase. The distortion it generates will depend on how fast it reacts, right? So a limiter will have a threshold. When the signal exceeds the threshold, it's going to start decreasing the volume. How fast it decreases the volume and what all the transitions are will pretty much define its sound. The faster they act, the more distortion they have, but the more loudness increase they provide. So it's going to be a trade-off between how much grunge you're willing to accept and how much loudness you really want. The feedback limiter is an interesting one. It's going to be hard because in most of the music production software, they don't really tell you what topology they're using, feed-forward or feedback. But the feedback limiter is an interesting one for equalization because it doesn't really increase THD and IMD so much. So it's one of the ones where you can actually increase your loudness significantly without having so many artifacts that it becomes inaudible. The only problem with the feedback limiter is that its peak control is not really good. So the peak will still exceed. You still need to do something to control the peak. And then the last one is the look-ahead limiter. So the look-ahead limiter really appeared in the last few years because everything's digital and we can memorize the signal as long as we want. But it's basically we're looking ahead. We're looking 20 or 30 milliseconds ahead, calculating the peak, and then we apply gain reduction before the peak occurs. So that's great because then all of a sudden the peak is not distorted, which is what you hear the most. However, their loudness increase, the perceived loudness increase is not as good. Now, you can imagine that it is possible to combine all those together. So you could have a bunch of feedback limiters that increase the loudness, but they don't control the peak. And then you finalize with a look-ahead limiter, which will control your peak, but not increase loudness. So there's ways to combine all those elements to be able to do peak control and loudness control to basically sculpt exactly your sound the way you want it to sound, while minimizing the artifacts associated with that process. So that's really what is necessary to learn to win the loudness war. So I plotted here various distortion spectra depending on which limiter was used. So the analog limiter is actually a feed-forward limiter. So you can see that its distortion is quite high. It's significant. The distortion of a limiter, it's called the splash. And it has to do with multiplying two functions. The sound itself, which is one function, and then your dynamic range reduction, which is another function. By multiplying those two functions, you somehow create a splash. That's the splash. So you can see that the analog limiter has, or the feed-forward limiter has a pretty high splash. Like I said, high THD, high IMD, but high loudness. The look-ahead limiter, on the other hand, has a lot less splash. So not so much distortion, not so much loudness. And then we can even improve on that. So it's a look-ahead limiter with a low pass, which basically it's a slower version of it. It reduces the speed of action of the look-ahead. And then we can get to ridiculously low amount of distortion. Look-ahead limiters are typically used for classical music, where, of course, we want to reduce the dynamic range because the quiet moments are really quiet, the loud moments are really loud. So if you try to put that through FM, you don't hear the quiet moments, basically. So there's really a need to decrease the dynamic range, but we're not aiming at competitive loudness. It's not rock and roll. So look-ahead limiters will be typically used in classical music loudness increase, or classical music radio stations will make a typical use of them. We can use them also for voice to prevent clipping. Although for most commercial radio stations, they try to have the voice of God, which means that that would not work for them. But it's also typically used for spoken words and things like that. So choosing your limiters right, or choosing your processing right, will help you define your sound and play well in the loudness war. So I have a bunch of examples we'll play with afterwards. Another one, phase. So phase is a relative timing difference between two signals. Typically, we talk about phase when we talk about a signal that is represented on a circle of 1. Well, a digital signal is usually represented on that type of circle. So the phase difference between two signals is a relative measurement. The phase impacts the frequency response. So who's playing the guitar? How many microphones do you, electric or acoustic? Okay. How many microphones do you use to record your guitar? And if so typically you keep those two tracks separate or you recombine them?
Later on, like in an S stereo signal to AB.
And then if you recombine them and one of them is out of phase, what happens?
Cancel each other out.
Completely?
Not like it's like I don't know what's called in English.
Comb filter. So it's actually used. Do you know what the first use of phasing was? It was for electric guitars with a single pickup. They would split the signal and then re-add them at a different phase. It's called flanging. So flanging, you've all used flanging before, right? So phasing could be used as an effect. That's a flanging of a little piece. That was a constant sound, and then just by flanging, we can make it sound all weird. So it is effectively very interesting when you record an instrument with multiple microphones to keep those tracks separate. Why? Because then all of a sudden all those effects can be applied later on. Once the flanging is applied electrically, you only have a single signal. You can't really separate them anymore. So whether you record a drum kit, whether you record a guitar, if you have several tracks, keep them separate. Pre-process them. You end up with one track or two tracks, depending on what you're doing, but keep them separate as your master, because then all of a sudden you have access to all the post-processing, flanging being one of them, and there's so many. So it's interesting, especially now that, I mean, you know, when you only had an 8-track or a 4-track, keeping all your tracks separate was just a nightmare. But now with computers, you have 99 tracks, and then for a $49 upgrade, you have 999 tracks. So why bother? So as much as possible, keeping your signals separate will alleviate errors as well. So it gives you more creative flexibility over time, but also in case you screwed up your wiring and you didn't have time to fix it, this and keeping your tracks separate will allow you to fix it later. So there's another side of phase, which is the phase between two channels in a binaural recording, so a binaural stereo recording, right? In phase and out of phase really plays an important role. You have no idea how many clubs I walk in and the speakers are out of phase. It happens all the time. It's really easy to hear, right? You've all heard out of phase. Who has heard out of phase? All right, so listen carefully, I get one.
You should now be hearing my voice in phase. You should now be hearing my voice out of phase.
So the way you notice it is, if you try to place yourself right in the middle of the speakers, there's going to be a hole where the mono signal should be. That's out of phase. The corollary to this is because low frequencies are really long waves. Although the two speakers are separated by a certain distance, the wave is long enough to provide a significant cancellation. So there's no bass. So phase check is an important part of sound reinforcement that, if I really believe what I'm hearing, it doesn't happen often enough. I didn't even check if those were in phase, by the way, but I'll check later. I hope they were for the demo. So the phase of the signal will be an important part of what you hear and what you can do with your signal. So yeah, keep your tracks separate. It's cheap enough now. So we talked a lot about the signal as a representation of an analog phenomenon, but now talked about computers as well. So digitalization is the step that will turn this analog signal into a digital signal. We do several things during the digitalization. The first one is sampling. So sampling, which means we discretize the time domain. We sample every so often. And the so often, for wow and flutter reason, has to be constant. So that's the sampling frequency, right? For a CD, for some reason I still don't understand, it's 44.1 kilohertz. Don't use it. Studios typically run at 48 kilohertz. Use that. And if you need to master a CD at the end, do a sample rate conversion. But 44.1, where did they pick that? So I've heard many explanations, one of them being that it was to synchronize with video. It's not true. It'd be 44.05. So that's not one. But there's another one that may just be true. Is the co-chairman of Sony was listening to a lot of operas, and a lot of operas are 65 to 71 minutes, and if you sample the CD at 48 kilohertz, that was only 60 minutes. By sampling at 44.1, there was a little bit more recording time. So it may just be that. I wouldn't be surprised. And the reason, yep.
It was actually mathematical for Beethoven symphony.
Yeah, they said that.
The symphony was supposed to fit on one CD.
Yeah, they said it was a specific one.
That's what I heard.
Yeah, I heard the same thing. But I think it's completely possible that Nahito actually said, like, that's what I want. And I wouldn't be surprised. It's the guy who single-handedly started the Walkman in 1979. He had enough political clout at Sony to make it happen. So yeah, we ended up with 44.1 kilohertz with the CD. Like I said, don't use it. And then if you need to master a CD, do it at the end. So that's one thing we do, is we sample the signal. Then the second thing we need to do is quantize, right? So now we have a sample every so often, but the sample is still analog. It can represent an infinite amount of values. So we decide we have steps. That's the quantization process. The quantization process will divide the amplitude of the signal into quantization levels. So with the sample signal, we talked about discrete time, continuous value. With a quantized signal, we talk about continuous time, discrete values. So the digital audio signal is both. It's sampled and quantized. So it has both bandwidth limitation and dynamic limitations. And those will play a lot, especially in the dynamics processing war. It will play a lot in what you're going to perceive at the end. The sound will be affected by those two elements, a lot more than you think. A lot of things that were completely possible in analog, like clipping in analog, is really not a problem. Clipping in digital just doesn't work, and it should be completely avoided. So those two little differences will actually have a lot of impact on what you can and you can do or shouldn't do in the digital domain. So bandwidth limitation, for those who haven't done so much mathematics, I'll go quickly over it. Mr. Nyquist, that comes from the information theory, actually, it was not from music. Mr. Nyquist said that we could only represent analog signal up to half the sampling frequency. So if we say 48 kilohertz, the highest frequency we can represent for is 24. What he also said is that aliases of the signal, so aliases, which means mirror signals, would be created at all multiples of the sampling frequency. So what we see is that we had that blue signal originally, and once we've sampled it, in fact, we have a replication of that signal over and over at all multiples of f. I'm only showing two sidebands, but in fact, they're infinite. So that's one thing, is bandwidth limitation. If you exceed that bandwidth limitation, aliasing will start to happen. Aliasing is what? Is when your sample images start to overlap, or your alias images start to overlap with your main image. That sounds horrible. That sounds horrible. Why? Because high frequency will be turned into a weird transposed version of it, which means it's not harmonically related. You will hear it. It really sounds broken. So one of the type of distortion that is new, and that is new because of the quantization, or the sampling, sorry, is aliasing. It was called for a long time digital grunge. And then dynamic range limitation. So we said we quantized, which means we try to have little steps to measure the signal. So the dynamic range is limited in two ways. Well, if we normalize the signal, we only know how to represent it from -1 to 1. If you exceed this range that is normalized to 1, we have no more numbers, which means it's going to clip. So there's an absolute upper limit. With analog, with a lot of analog gear, the limit was not that absolute, right? With tapes, you could push it. It would start to sound a bit grungy, but it was possible to push it. Vinyls, there was a limit, it was the mechanical limit of the vinyl and the stylus, but same thing, the Motown did it. It was a way to really kind of get to somehow an ever-increasing upper limit. With digital, that doesn't exist. The limit is there, and it's absolute. And then, so if we don't have room on the top, we should have room at the bottom, right? So we can effectively increase the resolution of the signal to get like lower and lower noise floor. There is effectively in digital no limit. In analog, there was a limit, the noise floor of your instrument. So we make better and better instruments, but if we really look over the last 50 years, we haven't decreased that limit so much. Right? We were at 20 microvolts RMS in the 70s. We're at 5 microvolts RMS today. So it's ×4, so it's 12 dB better. So in the last 30 years or 40 years, we decreased our noise floor by 12 dB. It's not that much. With digital, it's infinite. You just increase the number of bits, you increase your resolution. So you can get as much as you want. So I put some numbers. So 8 bits, which is used a lot for communication, and it's 50 dB. It's in red because it's inferior to the dynamic range of the ear. The CD with 16 bits, that's 65,000 values. That's 96 dB. It's still lower than what we can hear. 24-bit, commonly used in the studio, that's 16.7 million steps. That's 144 dB. We're happy now. It's more than what we can hear. And then 32-bit, so that's the 32-bit fixed point representations, 186 dB. But most of the time with a computer, you're going to use a 32-bit floating point, which is going to be effectively 24-bit of signal and 8 bits of exponent. So with 32 bits, you vastly exceed the needs for the representation of something you can hear and perceive. So I would say that overall, in the home studio environment, and especially today where computers are so fast, I would recommend going at least 24. And most of the digital instrument or digital effects you use today are using 32 float. It doesn't mean they've been well designed. It just means that the numbers they're using have the ability to be well used. This is not a seal for quality. 24-bit algorithm can be rendered really, really well. Most of the broadcast processors, even today, are 24-bit fixed point. It just requires to be a bit careful because there's only 144 dB of dynamic range. But saying 32 float is not necessarily a sign of quality. They can be misused more often than not they are. So aliasing distortion is a problem. We know that if the signal bandwidth exceeds or extends too much in digital, it's going to start to alias. So there's 2 ways to prevent this. The first one is pre-process your samples. Pre-process your samples so they're the bandwidth you need, not the bandwidth they are. For example, if you use a lot of samples that come from the internet, or use a lot of samples that come from MP3, low pass, if you can. Make sure that you've removed all the energy you don't need, and do that as early as possible. Because as soon as you go into dynamics processor like limiters and all that, they will increase the bandwidth. So if your bandwidth is already 20 kilohertz, you start to run it in through a limiter, and you're at 48 kilohertz sampling rate, you will exceed your bandwidth. You will turn this into aliasing, and that happens all the time. So there's 2 solutions, but they're in fact the same. You can band limit your signal, or you can oversample. Oversampling will increase the sampling rate, which will give you more room for the splash, or more room for frequency extension. So typically, I would recommend mastering at 192 kilohertz, or even at 384 kilohertz if you can. Problem with that, of course, all your files become huge. The processing takes more time, but as long as you're not in a live environment, who cares? We can even imagine, and it's happening right now, that the same way video is doing nonlinear editing, audio can do nonlinear editing as well. So in fact, when you're editing and mixing, you're editing and mixing at 48 kilohertz, or even in MP3, but you keep your high-res tracks, and at the end you do a mount cue point. So it's going to reassemble all your high-res tracks, but then offline. So you leave the computer for 2 or 3 days to do its job, and then when you come back, it's done. But I would recommend avoiding mastering at 48K unless your mastering is very simple, because all your dynamics processing will generate aliasing distortion. There's just no way around it. And then at the end, you have that really high-res mastering, you have your tracks that are huge, you finalize, so you do your loudness processing, and then you downsample. Don't do the opposite. Finalizing is going to be the process that generates the most distortion. It is really not the right time to try to reduce the bandwidth. So keep the bandwidth as wide as possible during all the mastering process. The last step should be the downsampling to CD, to whatever you want to do. Also be mindful that your mastering will have to be mindful of the medium. You don't master the same way for a vinyl, for a CD, for radio, or for encoded media. They all have their little specifics. Mastering, it's really one size doesn't fit all. One size fits all if you have the dynamic range and you're willing to not be loud. But if you want to achieve loudness, then it's not that simple. Headroom. That's my favorite subject. So it's funny because like every time I look at view meters lately, I see everything crammed in the red, and they basically don't move. So the 0 dB in digital is the full scale. So that's the place where we don't have numbers anymore. But in fact, the digital filters that are in your player, whether it's a CD player or whatever, they ring. Which means that if you put a Dirac, do you know what a Dirac is? It's a single impulse of amplitude 1, so maximum amplitude, your filter may ring higher than 1. Typically, the filters ring 3 dB. So it means that you should not only stay away from 0 dB, but you should stay away from minus 3 dB, at least. So planning for headroom, always plan to have more than 16 bits. 24-bit is a minimum for resolution, for recording and mixing. With 20 bits we know 20 bits of signal covers what we can hear, that's 120 dB, then 4 bits of headroom. So that means that your signals, the average level of your signals should be around minus 24 dBFS, which is a lot lower than what I see people do. And even at minus 24, when you mix two signals together, you may be close to clipping already. So I would say 24 dB is a good headroom. Yep.
But isn't it like that most PAWs calculate with 32 bits float in the box?
Yeah.
So you can, well, still the 0 dBFS, which I would see in my mixing view, is related to 24 bits.
It is related to 24 bits.
So I have a headroom of 8B.
That,
8 bits, I'm sorry.
you have, actually, you would be at 24.0 here? No, you would be at, yeah, you're at 24.0. So you would have, that's what I said, this is a fixed point 24-bit. So that's where you want to have at least 24 dB of margin. On a 32-bit float, there's more flexibility. It's not a guarantee that it's well done, and I would still recommend leaving headroom on the fixed point representation. But that, on a 32-bit process, that can be done at the end, instead of having to be done at the beginning. But that's correct. So on a 32-bit float, yeah, the headroom will be around 80 dB or something like that, which is a lot more comfortable. But on a fixed point representation, it would work roughly like this. And be mindful when mixing. When you add two tracks together, so if we add two noises together and they're completely uncorrelated, which means they don't know each other and they're not at all friends, their average loudness or their average power loudness will add by 3 dB. It's going to sound 3 dB louder. But their peak is going to add by 6 dB. So in fact, always plan for 6 dB of headroom when you're adding two tracks together. They may not use it, but they may use it. So your 80 dBs with a 24 track, they're gone.
Sorry. I'm still thinking about what you said about upsampling before the mastering. How exactly would you do it? If you have your mix down, and then you would go to your mastering.
Oh no! You bring your mix down. Your mix down is high res. All your tracks are high resolution. The first process you do is pre-processing each and every of your track. So I've been everyone.
After recording in 44.
Well,
44.1.
I would not record at 44.1.
Okay.
I would record at 96.
96.
Yeah. So the reality right now, and that's, I mean, this is going to go pretty technical. The reality right now is most of the A to D converters that you use are using brick wall filters. So instead of starting to, after 20 kilohertz, to slowly roll off, they use the maximum bandwidth and then they drop sharply. Those digital filters are quite unfriendly, the brick walls. They ring, but they pre-ring, which is a really weird one. Is there any way I can draw here? No. Okay, so basically, if you look at the response of a digital filter on a square wave, it starts to oscillate before the transition. And that oscillation is effectively non-causal because what's going to cause the oscillation happens after the oscillation. So that's the phenomenon of brick wall filtering. There are new types of filters that deal with that better, but they're not very commonly used yet. They're called minimum phase filters. Yes?
So what do you think about the 88.2 to minimize the downsampling artifacts?
88.2 would work because you would divide by 2 at the end. But in fact, dividing by an integer or by a non-integer, it doesn't change really your response. In both cases, you're going to have the same issues. So integer versus non-integer with an finite impulse response filter, what you do if it's non-integer is you upsample and downsample instead of just downsampling. But effectively, it's the same filter. It's really, it doesn't really matter as much as, so you recorded 96K. Now you have those samples which have 48K of bandwidth, literally, maybe 44, just with a transition band. That's where you start filtering. You don't want to keep all that 48K of bandwidth, because same thing, you apply dynamics processing to it, you're back to your problems, you start to have aliasing again. So the first process would be to take all those tracks and low-pass filter them with a much gentler filter, right? It doesn't need to be a brick wall.
So you would do the track per track, every track.
I would batch.
High pass and low pass, probably.
I would batch it, yeah. Well, high pass typically, if it's really an HD converter, it usually includes a high pass, right? Because they're non-DC accurate. So most HD converters have an embedded high pass. High pass filter is tricky for computers because of something called limit cycles. So because the coefficients are so small and so close to 0, you end up making a lot of errors. Because the filters are very long, that errors adds up and all that. So typically in high-end HD converters, they've been well managed. I don't think in most equipment you can actually defeat it unless it's really high-end. But I would definitely low pass. And make sure that all my tracks are ready for dynamics processing to try to minimize the artifacts when you effectively do it. So, I mean, 96K, yep.
On which frequencies exactly would you low pass?
It all depends on what you, right? So if it's voice, you don't need 20K.
Oh, that's true.
With voice, you can start to low pass at 15K with a second order. There's an advantage using IAR filters instead of FIR. They ring as well, but they're causal, thank you. So they don't have pre-echoes. So that's kind of an advantage. There's a lot of other filters that can be used. I mean, a lot of reading their apodizing filters will remove the ringing from the A to D filter, for example. So there's a bunch of things that can be used. So typically when you upsample, so when you go from 96 to 192, you do this by filtering. It's a low-pass filtering. So the goal here will be to find the right low-pass, possibly a selectable low-pass that you can run in batch that will pre-process all your tracks. So which bandwidth? It all depends on what the sound is made of. And so talking about floating point, right? You say 80 dB of headroom. That's not 18 tracks.
We have like 15, 20 minutes left.
Okay, I'm almost done. So imagine that you have a 24-track recorder. Each track adds 6 dB. That's a lot more than 80. So although the problem is more severe with a 24-bit fixed point, it still happens in floating point. We quickly run out of bandwidth. And especially now that we can keep all our tracks separate, which is lovely, when we add all those tracks together, we'll still be very mindful of dynamic range, because we quickly run out of it. So equalization, I'm going to go quickly on this. People are used to the graphical EQ, remember? You can boost or cut and all that. With digital, it's really not a good idea, because when you start boosting, headroom is a problem. So let's say you boosted your bass and your high frequency 12 dB, you may have 24 dB more output. So really, is that the best we can do? No, there's a better way to look at it. Graphic equalizer is just because we've seen them for 30 years or 40 years, we're used to them. But in fact, subtractive method makes a lot more sense. So instead of boosting, you cut all the rest. So then you always remove, you never add. That's a lot safer approach. And we can do exactly the same thing. The filters are the same and all that. If you really want to add some boost, that means you need to attenuate the signal to compensate right? So it's going to be a trade-off between noise floor and equalization. Overall, be mindful of the perception. So two things happen. If you've been listening to the same track for the entire day, your ear's tired. We say you hear better in the morning. So I would recommend not making decisions after a long day of mixing because your ear is tired. Aging, that's another cute one. So it's funny, a lot of recordings from Michael Jackson from the 80s are really bright. Do you know why? Because it was Quincy Jones, and Quincy Jones could not hear shit by that time. He's a great producer, don't get me wrong, but he should have asked the young guy to be like, how my house? Because he didn't. And so all the CDs that came out at that time sounded extremely brittle. Now all those CDs have been remastered, so they sound a lot louder and not as brittle. But that's something you need to consider, especially if you've done a lot of front house work, which means you're basically mixing music for concerts. Your ear is probably damaged. So make sure that you ask the young guy with clean ears to to clean your high frequencies at the end. That's a common issue that we find a lot. And it doesn't, the artistic talent of the person with hearing loss is, really usually not gone. Everything's there. It's just the perception of high frequency is really a problem. So I would recommend always asking the rookie, and also always use different systems. Most expensive studios are going to have a small pair of speakers, a big pair of speakers. You may not have, in a home environment, access to all this. But bringing the music to other environments will be enlightening on how they behave. Headphones is a good one because it's really like extremely low distortion and you can get pretty much as loud as you want. But because of the low distortion, you will have a perception that's very specific. So that's another one, is a diversity of places to listen to your stuff. Like I said, the brain compensates for frequency differences for left and right. Once you've listened to your system for a month, you're used to it. You don't hear it almost anymore. Or at least it's color. You still hear the problems like saturations and all that, but the color of the system, somehow you get used to. So it's good to, there's a saying, I think it's like taking the veal to the next field because the grass is better, something like that. So yeah, have a diversity of listening environments will help with making decisions, especially for EQing. So producing, which is what we have been talking pretty much for all day, I would recommend during the mixing keeping everything clean, keeping the high dynamic range, keeping the wide bandwidth, keeping your files enormous. Hard drives are cheap those days. It's worth it. Producing is a little bit making things sexy, right? Being able to sell them. That's the producing part of it. So there's a lot of artistic decisions here. Maybe for certain tracks, having a lot of saturation is desirable, but that should not impact your initial mixing. That should remain clean. Those should be after effects added. Even if you process track by track, those are, and if it's done for artistic reason, try to keep your tracks or your original tracks as clean as possible. Taste change over time, but also, like I said, producing for various mediums may have different requirements. And then finally, finalizing is really when you deal with the medium, whether it's CD, whether it's radio. And so all the post-processing, all the production at this point, all the finalizing has to be medium aware. It cannot be done in a vacuum. And downsampling is the last process. That's when you bring the sample rate to the format you want to distribute in. But that should be the last step. So, yeah, if you produce for CD, or for analog broadcast, or for digital broadcast, or for high resolution, or for streaming media, they all are going to have their little specials. One of the good ones, is for internet radios. They use MP3 or AAC codecs. Those codecs, what they do is, they look at the spectra, so they divide all that into bands, and they're like, oh, that band's really strong, masking, I'm removing those ones and all that. Once you've jacked up all your signal, and you've added a tremendous amount of distortion for loudness, the spectra is full. Which means all of a sudden the encoder is like, and that's how you make MP3 sound really bad. Is because all of a sudden it still needs to compress. It has a mandate. The mandate is you need to output 128 kilobits per second because that's all I have as a channel. But it's going to do it, but the decision it's going to make are going to be less and less accurate. And then all the problems associated with MP3 or AAC are going to show up. There was a big problem with DAB radios. They were using an older codec than MP3. They were using MPEG-1 layer 2, so MP2. And a lot of people were complaining about DAB that sounded like crap. So now they did DAB+, and DAB+ using a lot more recent codec. It's using AAC high efficiency, which is the same that they're using with HDFM. But essentially, if you try to make your media too loud, it's going to be a problem for all the psychoacoustic compressors. It's going to affect also the lossless encoder, which is not going to be able to encode at all, and it's going to end up having basically the same size as the original CD. So the lossless encoder will work a lot better when the dynamic range is high. So we noticed that for a lossless encoder, it's 3 to 4 times compression on classical music. It's about 1 time, which means no compression at all on heavy rock and roll. So it's heavily signal dependent. So the computer that you're going to use for that, you've noticed, although I worked for Apple, I'm using a PC. Why? Because it's a lot cheaper right now, especially if you want to have many, many hard drives to do all that process and to store all your tracks. So high resolution and compressed tracks, they're going to be large. There's a high track count, so that's going to be even larger. So one of the ways to deal with this is to pre-produce. Everybody's doing it. I'm sure you're doing it as well. So you pre-produce your tracks, especially if you're in a live environment. There's a lot of value in having smaller files. They're going to make your computer a lot more reliable, prevent the hiccups. So same thing for a live environment. All that I said about high resolution may not apply. You have to be a bit mindful of the amount of processing power you have, because you're not allowed to go off stage. Storage stress. So in the recent years, we've seen mechanical hard drives replaced by SDDs or flash hard drives. So flash hard drives are great because not only are they fast to give you the data that you've requested, but they're fast seeking for that data because there's no head that has to look for data over the drive. Yeah.
In the future, will this, the new Pro Tools puts pretty much the whole project in the Arbeitsspeicher?
In RAM.
In the RAM, yeah. And so this won't really be a problem in the future.
As soon as you get 128 terabyte of RAM.
Yeah.
That's not yet. You still need drives right now.
But just the audio files you're processing, they're all going to be in the...
Well, the audio tracks overall, an hour of high-res music at 192 kilohertz, 24-bit, that's 2 gigabytes. So, in fact, with high resolution, yeah, it's not really possible keeping everything in RAM. So, larger storage is still a necessity. Using SSD really solves the problem. SSD typically are 4 to 5 times faster than hard drives. The problem is aging with SSD, right? So, each little cell in the SSD can be written about 1,000 times, not more. The way they make the hard drive life last longer is by trying to rewrite the oldest cell that was unused, right? So compared to a hard drive, here we are not trying to remove the diverse, because access is so fast, it doesn't matter if a piece of the file is there and a piece of the file is somewhere else. So you just write over data that is not used anymore. But with large files and all that, that's going to happen a lot. So the lifespan of an SDD used for music is not so good. Typically, on a computer, we want to have 3 to 5 years of hard drive life with an SDD. If you get 1 year in music production, that's going to be about most of it. So be mindful that SDDs are great. They will allow to store many tracks. They will allow to retrieve many tracks simultaneously. They will age faster, which means that you'd better do some backups, because they do fail. And the day they fail, there is no going back. With a hard drive, mechanical hard drive, if it fails, you can still spend €5,000, bring it to like the computer forensic, and it's going to try to extract your data with an SSD. There's no such thing. So be a bit mindful that SSDs are great, but they're also a lot more fragile than their mechanical homologue, at least when it comes to multiple writes and multiple erase. Processing stress, so the high sampling rate is going to increase the stress on your system as well. There's always a trade-off. You can say, well, you know, I'm going to keep all my tracks at 48 kilohertz for now because I don't have the processing power that is adequate. If it takes you too much time, it doesn't make any sense. But there's one thing for certain with computers, is the toilet paper theory. So Mr. Moore said that every 2 years or every 18 months, effectively, we can put twice as many transistors onto the same piece of silicon. The price of the piece of silicon is constant, which means for the same price every 18 months, you can do twice as much. So don't consider the computer an investment. The investment is all the music you have and all the tracks you have. The computer is effectively a piece of toilet paper. Typically for a casual user, the replacement rate for a computer is 3 years. For power users, which you are, if you produce music, it's going to be 12 to 18 months. So size it right. Don't spend too much money and replace often. Will probably go a long ways. So the little piece of warning, failure rate, fast SSDs, what did I say, SSD, whatever. Fast SSDs will fail, so they're great. They're great for scratch and batch files, but they also have a short lifespan. Be mindful of this. They may have a longer lifespan on casual users, but when you write and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite to be able to do undos, not so much. Backing up, there's something called the 111 method. So you have RAID drive in your computer. It's 2 or multiple hard drives that copy your data. So if one fails, it's still there. That's good enough, at least for now. But if your house burns down, that didn't save you. So then you have one remote backup that you keep in a different location. You don't do it as often, but it's a good idea to have it. It can save you a lot of hassle. And then the last one is have sequential backups. Don't keep only one copy of a backup. Have a copy from last month and a copy from 2 months ago and a copy for 3 months ago. Viruses are here, worms are here. Sometimes your data is already corrupted for a little while before you actually notice it. So having sequential backups is kind of a good idea. Hard drives are cheap right now. You can buy a 2 terabyte hard drive for $60. So it's worth being a bit diligent. It's annoying. It's like cleaning a room, but it's a good idea. I think that's all I have. That's all I have. I had example of the loudness war if you're interested, and I also have a running multiband compressor that is typically used for increasing loudness of recording. So maybe you can do that for people who want to stay, because it's going to be a bit more computer centric. But yeah, that was my talk.
Maybe we can have some questions.
Ja, okay.
Ich würde euch gerne bitten, wenn ihr Fragen habt, genau wie ich jetzt, an dieses Mikro zu kommen, weil sonst Julian keine Chance hat, eure Fragen aufzunehmen. So, and maybe you can, vielleicht könnt ihr auch euch dann schon dahin bewegen, sodass wir nicht warten müssen, bis ihr euch da durch die Reihe durchgequetscht habt. So my first question is, would you give us a little introduction of yourself?
Oh yeah, I didn't do it at the beginning. Hi, my name is Cyril. I designed my first audio amplifier. I was 9. It didn't work. And then I started to make speakers when I was 11. They didn't work so well either, I have to admit. My first success was a battery charger. It was a lot simpler. But then I studied both electronic and signal processing in France. And then I moved to Cleveland for an internship, designing processors for TV and radio. So it was full-on loudness war for a few years. I was doing both hardware and software development for them. I stayed there 3 years. And then after that, I was hired by Apple to do computer audio, mainly for laptops and desktop computer. At the time, the iPod didn't exist. So I stayed there for 5 years. It was a lot of electronics. A lot of what I'm presenting today about dynamics processing and all that are things that we use in computers. You can imagine that with a speaker that big in a laptop, it's kind of difficult to get the sound out. So a lot of those techniques are actually commonly used today. And that's why I would like to touch on the loudness war, because if you pre-process your signal not improperly, the post-processing in FM or in a computer will make it sound worse. Because we are doing a lot of this in real time. And more it's going to happen in your living room as well. You know, we're talking about sound bars, we're talking about all those systems. They all are using dynamics processing. They all basically are weird nonlinear devices. And then after that, after 5 years at Apple, I decided that it was time to go because those people are crazy. And I went and worked for BlackBerry to do even smaller and even less power and even more complicated stuff. But it's basically very similar. Whether we talk about a handheld or a desktop computer, it's based on similar architectures. It presents very similar challenges. It's just, of course, the smaller it gets and the less power you have, it just becomes a bit harder. So that's who I am.
I have a follow-up question. So where do you think BlackBerry is headed?
This you will have to call our marketing department.
Okay. So don't be shy, ask questions. He's only here once.
Did you yourself do professional recordings?
I do. I'm more on the playback side. Mm-hmm. So not as much the recording side than the reproduction. But yeah, between setting up studios, setting up playback environments as well. A little bit of room acoustics, although I'm not as versed into room acoustic than digital processing. And then also on the consumer side, how to make those tiny devices sound good. So we talk about more than one speaker, we talk about a lot of processing as well. So yeah, but more on the playback.
And is there a possibility for us to get this slideshow to memorize what we just...
Sure.
I just asked if you could get the...
I'll show the PDF.
Okay.
You won't have the little moving things and you won't have the WAV files.
Of course, but it's just for memorizing.
Sure.
Thanks.
With new high-resolution technology and all that stuff, do you think the loudness war will continue like that? Things will get even louder and crappier, or will
they're not
things
necessarily
get
crappy.
better?
I think they're fun. I think pointing the finger to the loudness war is one thing. Realizing that you still need to make money for a living is another. So the loudness war is here to stay. We're going to keep on processing your medium. It's just impossible to stop at this point. Now doing it wisely, right? So, but I imagine that you may have several releases. You may have one release for the iTunes store, and you assume that your consumer, through that particular medium, will not have as good of a stereo, will be more like portable media users and things like that. And then you model your processing to this, and then you may sell the same album onto like hdtracks.com at 192 kilohertz. And then all of a sudden you have a lot more relaxed processing, right? So be mindful of the medium. Saying no, right? So, and there's many ways to achieve loudness, but yeah, it's really crying on spilled milk at this point. The milk is spilled. Competitive loudness is here to stay.
All right.
But I would agree with you, turn it up would be a good thing, but our opinion is all it is. It's an opinion.
Can you tell a little bit more about what you did exactly at Apple and a little bit about the signal processing they use, or is it kind of secret or under NDA?
I can talk about the long lines. Most of my developments were into audio codecs, so electronic devices for audio recording and playback, but the chips, and then all the processing associated with it. So whether it is to add a signal processor, we do that a lot, for example, in cell phones. Although now cell phones have relatively powerful processor, we're talking about a dual Cortex A9 and all that, there's significant amount of power, they would drain the battery way too fast. So we add specific engines to do signal processing that are a lot smaller and a lot more dedicated. So in computing, there's really two types of engine. There's general computing, which is Pentiums and all that. And then there are signal processors, and they have a different architecture. Overall, a signal processor would have more of a super Harvard architecture, which means it's able to access a lot of data at the same time, while a computer will have a modified Harvard. It's a more like linear process. So data plane processing is really what we're talking about when we talk about audio processing. So at Apple, we put in place, or when I was there, we put in place a lot of multiband limiters, ways to do speaker modeling better than we were doing at the time.
You use FIR filters with inverse filtering?
That doesn't work so well.
Okay.
Try it at home. If you have one of those, what's the name of that company that did that a lot? I forgot their name right now. That would basically do phase and impulse response correction. It's a Californian company, I forgot. Try to set one up properly and then disable it. And it does bring something, but it breaks something at the same time. And it breaks something in the time domain. Everything sounds a bit mushy. So no, we didn't use that. The other thing with those processors is they have a tendency to increase dynamic range. When your speaker is the size of a nail, it's not a good idea. So it was more the same approach as broadcasting, multiband compressors, limiters, and things like that. Just try to get the loudness out.
All on hardware processed before the loudspeakers.
Oh yeah, well it would be done both in hardware and software. So some of the processes were done in CoreOS, Core Audio in the OS, and other processing were done in the codec or in a dedicated engine. So it depends on what the process is. General purpose processors are great at some things, they're really awful at doing some other operations, so you need to split carefully. Typically, what we don't want to put on a general purpose processor is something that requires very low delay. Because every time we have a process that requires very low delay, it needs to have a really high priority, so it's interrupting all the other processes. If it happens often, you end up spending so much time doing only that thing. Right? So for voice processing in a phone, for example, it's 20 milliseconds. So, which means every 20 milliseconds you get a new packet, you get to be done with the previous one, which means a lot of interrupts. And all in all, it's not a good idea to use the general processor to do that because you're waking it up all the time and then your battery's gone. So it's a trade-off. Of course, I would love to have giant DSPs everywhere. They're really convenient to use. But
did you even use DSP? Did you even use DSP hardware processors for the headphone output of your iPod or something else? Or is this just kept in usual DA processor?
The codec has a little bit of processing. Typically, what is done in the codec is EQing. And then they use a one-band limiter a little bit because of all the problem with EQing associated with dynamic range, right? So for EQ to work without clipping, it's usually an EQ followed by a one-band limiter. But that's done in the codec, yeah. Right now, if I look at the iPhone, or what I know of the iPhone architecture, because I've not been working there for 6 years, the mixing is in the codec. So it's essentially an iPod Touch and a phone, and then everything connects at the codec, and the codec does the mixing. So yeah, the codec would be doing the finalizing, which we've talked here for various medium. When you talk about speaker playback, it is finalizing as well, right? So the codec is doing the finalizing here. On some of our devices, BlackBerry, we actually have a DSP to do the finalizing. Right, so we have a hardware engine for that. Qualcomm, which is providing chipsets for a tremendous number of phones, also added something called the QDSP, which is a hardware engine for audio as well. In a phone, I mean, we easily consume 200 to 400 million instructions per second for voice processing, right? Between removing the echo, improving intelligibility, doing the vocoder, voice codec, right? The vocoder and all that. All those are pretty big. I mean, in a half-band or half-rate voice codec is 30 to 40 megahertz on a general-purpose processor. So it's not small. Of course, if we talk about 1.2 gigahertz, that doesn't seem small. But if you add all the process together, 400 megahertz would be a quarter of it. So that would drain your battery real fast.
And that's what you also did for RIM, also the audio part of the whole BlackBerry phones.
I have more multimedia stuff now, but that just came along with it. But yeah, mostly it's audio and sequencing data.
Since you were talking a lot about loudness, do you think the LUFS is a reasonable way of metering loudness? And
there's many. The one we use in radio is the durometer. So the durometer is basically a filter bank followed by weighting, and then you add all the banks and you get your meter. And then there's several new approaches that have been proposed. Most of them do not take in consideration There's a time domain, so an integration particularities with loudness that is a bit elusive. So the durometer was already doing multiband integration. That's I think what everybody's doing. And then loudness will also be a question of perception. If your ears are shut, your perception of loudness, for example, in the mid-range and high frequency will be gone. So then what does loudness mean? And then the last aspect of loudness is distortion. Right, so that's a psychoacoustic effect of loudness, which is not taken in consideration. So I guess it's as good as it gets.
Okay.
I would use a durometer or something like that. It's a good indication. Listening is a good one too.
But would you use it during mixing?
I wouldn't. No, but I would use an oscilloscope during mixing to make sure that I didn't clip anything. So, and I wouldn't rely on soft oscilloscope because they lie to you. So, I would. My main worry in digital would be clipping effectively. If you want to increase loudness, if you want to do clipping and all that, it has to be managed clipping. You don't clip your signal. So it's essentially non-aliasing clippers and all that. There's a lot of choices now with Audition, and there's a tremendous number of choices.
Because the European Broadcast Union just released a paper that it must be minus 23 LUFS.
Well,
for pretty much every TV station in Europe.
But that's for TV stations, right?
Only TV.
So
I think no, radio too.
But that's an electrical level. With a multiband compressor, you can make that sound really, really loud, right?
True.
So, and I mean, the same techniques apply to FM and AM are applied to TV as well now. One of the benefits is that commercials don't blow in your face like they used to because it's effectively finalized. But yeah, it's a medium that is just as compressed as FM was 10 years ago. So the risk of doing a lot of multiband and doing a lot of finalizing is that everything sounds like FM. Now the problem is when you try to run your CD that sounds like FM into an FM processor, that thing goes crazy and it doesn't work well at all. So then, and then at the end you end up sounding really, really bad, which is bad for business. So I'd be a bit careful with broadcast in general. I mean, being on the safe side will mean that, yeah, turn it down. Right? That's really being on the safe side. Now, there's some markets where it may not cut it, right? So I would say that life is unfair. And if you want to build your own little kingdom, well, you have to be unfair with it as well. And if that costs you to do some recordings that are heavily compressed, or because that's what people are expecting. We don't always do what we like. If you do music and you like making music, that's a good start. Then after that, adapting to the market and being marketable is also a big piece of it. But yeah, I would have no shame over compressing something if it was necessary. So why not? Just with more tools and more understanding of what you're doing, maybe you can also make it sound better, right?
Do you know if there's any kind of processor which emulates, for example, the FM processor or something, so you could at home do a comparison between, yeah.
I have one here. Oof. So that's not the FM broadcast version, that's the home audio version of Breakaway. But Breakaway has 3 or 4 different versions. One of them is a dual version for DJs, so it allows to pre-process each turntable. And then after that, you do your mixing, but both of your tracks have been pre-processed. There's the home, like this one, and then there's a broadcast version. So, oh, okay. Let's find a crowd pleaser. So that was the way Like a Virgin sounded when it was first released. Processor is in bypass. 20 years later. So here it's indicating clipping, right?
I made it through the wilderness. Somehow I made it through.
That's through a radio processor.
Didn't know how lost I was until I found you. I would be incomplete. I've been
So it's typical of the processor fighting. If I take the original version,
boy. My fear is fading fast.
it doesn't fight as much.
And saving it all for you, 'cause only love can last.
That's the, sorry.
And you're mine.
That's the French Kiss radio station. That's their preset.
Make me strong. Yeah, you make me fall. Oh, you love thought out.
So,
Yeah, you love thought out. What was
so the more you compress your recording, the more it's going to fight with the second processor, right? So if I take something a bit more relaxed,
scared and cold, like a virgin. Hey,
same thing.
touch for the
So there's been a problem for a long time that a lot of FM broadcasters are complaining about, is that they have to recess their processor a lot when music is already overly compressed. Otherwise, it really sounds bad. So that's been a typical problem. But if we look at something that is not recorded, like a hammer, oh, here, New Order, for example. So that's before, right? It actually works quite well. So that was particularly quiet though. But you can see that they're easily 6 dB down even at the mastering level, right? So you can download this, it's free for a month, you can play with it. It's not the best processor. The best processors are $10,000 and they're hardware beasts. But that's a good way to play with it. I find a bit the lack of control to be frustrating. I'd like to get more control, but I think it gives a good idea. Then after that, there's several processors that are available. There's one from Omnia, which is the first company I worked for, which are basically compressed radio processors and things like that that also run on the PC. That can be good to play around with. There's a lot of options right now. There's many available for Adobe Audition. There's many available as VST plugins. I guess you need to get comfortable with the one you're playing with. That's artistic decisions. I said I'm not taking care of those.
We ran out of time. We ran out of time. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cyril.
You're welcome.